If you follow the news closely, take a closer look at what's happening in the war of Ukraine. Now, at this moment, and there's no denying this nation is standing at the crossroads. On one hand, and despite the fallout between US President Donald Trump and the current President Zelensky in the White House not too long ago. And in addition, everyone is saying that is it time for Ukraine to reassess the situation in the war? And also, politically speaking, this is more than just fighting against Russia. It's really about fighting against this political distortion or this political distorted ideology. What's happening in the Ukraine right now totally reflects what's happening around the world. Now, these days, that you might be familiar with the word democratic system or authoritarianism, but did you know that today there's another critical concept is quietly creeping upon our nation, which is the illiberalism? How do we understand that? And by seeing that what Donald Trump is doing domestically and internationally, why is it critical for us to bring this on the agenda and so that and more people start to understand the significance and the indispensable impact of illiberalism? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Stephen Hahn. Dr. Hahn received his PhD at Yale University, and he is currently a professor of history at New York University. He is a specialist on the international history of slavery, emancipation, and race, on the construction of American empire, on the social and the political history of the long 19th century in the US. He's completing a textbook called Contested America, a history of the US and the people who made it. Well, again, Professor Hahn, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, Professor Hahn, again, as I mentioned before, it's critical that we need to understand what's happening in the US domestically. But meanwhile, believe me, there seems to be a great correlation between what's happening in the nation of Ukraine and also in the nation of the US. Can you help us? I want to start with the fundamental question. What is the modern day definition of illiberalism, and why is it critical for us to understand by looking at Trump administration? Your thoughts?
Well, that's a good question. Illiberalism, I found very useful, not only to describe what's going on in the current moment, but to think about it historically, because in the United States, as you probably know, for the most part, our history has been interpreted in terms of a liberal tradition, a political tradition in particular that emphasizes individual rights, participation in political life, equal standing before the law, representative institutions and the like. What I've tried to do in my book and in my thinking about this is to recognize that there are other really powerful currents in American history. Illiberalism is only one of the other ones, but it's an important one. And what I would say is that although my understanding of illiberalism is something that changes over time and can be seen in a lot of different ways, it tends to have a number of characteristics. You might think about it as a reservoir of perspectives and ideas and practices. One, it emphasizes inequality, inequalities that are social, civil, political, inequalities that are regarded as basically natural, which is inequalities of race and gender and nationality. Illiberalism struggles for what you might call some version of cultural and or religious homogeneity. Think about what Orban has been doing in Hungary, or think about Christian nationalism in the United States. Illiberalism has an idea of what you might call limited rights, which is to say people can have rights, but unlike in liberal sensibilities, which are, broad, universal, or human rights, which you carry with you wherever you go, illiberals think about rights as, you can have your rights over there, but you don't necessarily have your rights over here. Illiberals mark internal and or usually both external enemies, and they advocate exclusions or expulsions as a way of resisting them. Illiberals tend to be very comfortable with the idea of violence as a means of achieving or maintaining power. And illiberalism is really about the will of the community over the rule of law. And so, as you were pointing out, one of the things that's important to understand about today is that we're in a very broad illiberal moment. It's not only in the United States, but clearly the United States is very much a part of it. It's becoming a pretty extreme part of it. But as you suggested, we need to have a global perspective, because illiberalism in the United States, or liberalism in Russia, or liberalism in Hungary, or Italy, or the many places that it has erupted, are fed by illiberal ideas and illiberal victories elsewhere.
Dr. Hahn, when we talk about political ideology, or going back to how you describe the illiberalism, again, you mentioned the social inequality and individual freedom, etc. I want to borrow a quote from a former historian. Of course, he is also a well-known diplomat, which is Dr. Henry Kissinger. And one time that he mentioned that the political system, or the correct way to deal with political system, is not to handle the wicked, but to get rid of the limitation for the righteous. And of course when he used that quote, or when he used that phrase, he was directly referring to the Cold War period, and also to the relationship, or what we say, the ongoing competition between US and China. But I want to go back to what you mentioned before regarding this violent behavior, or we talk about this individual freedom. Dr. Hahn, you are the expert, and since day one, or even prior to Donald Trump's election, that he has been very vocal about the deportation of the illegal immigrants. And we're seeing that, right now at this moment, even American citizens, the lives are at stake. So in other words, it's not just about the illegal immigrants. It's more about the fate of American citizens at this moment.
Yes.
And of course, that his rhetoric incited violence from the left to the right. So Dr. Hahn, from your perspective, why are people buying into such rhetoric? And even though that some of the Republicans, or even though some of the trumpeters, they know that this is not acceptable, or Trump has completely crossed the line, how should we explain his behavior from the illiberal perspective? And are we going to say more people tend to see this as it's an ongoing trend, or this is going to be an ongoing change, so the nation has to accept it? Are we seeing any alternatives? Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, we don't have to accept anything. And one of the obviously disconcerting things is that Donald Trump, ran his campaign not only in 2024, but earlier, stoking hostility to undocumented people in the United States. He described it as an invasion. So it was both people who were enemies without and became enemies within. In some ways, one of the things we need to understand is that Trump has not only tapped into fear, because, from his point of view, power is about fear, is making people fearful of their situation, either their personal situation, their economic situation, or the likes, the ways in which they're going to be punished. And as you mentioned, American citizens, or people with firm legal status in the United States, have been rounded up, detained, and in some cases deported. This does tie into a long tradition in the United States of what you might call expulsion. How do you deal with people you regard as threats or standing in the way of your ambitions? Think about Native people in the United States. In the, right from the start of European settlement, Europeans were trying to either push Native people out away from their homelands or exterminate them. In the 19th century, Andrew Jackson oversaw the expulsion of thousands of Native people from east of the Mississippi River out to what was called Indian Territory in the Trans-Mississippi. Think about the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Asian Exclusion Acts, and the hostility that many communities, especially in the West, had to Chinese, mostly men, and workers who were building the railroads, who were mining minerals, and they got run out and in many cases killed. So I do think, and in this current moment, my fear, and I think it's pretty clear what's happening, is that Trump is trying to make everyone fearful that if he turns on them for any one of a number of reasons, they're going to suffer very serious consequences. He asked for a fivefold increase in funding for detention centers. And this is not just going to be for undocumented people. This is going to be for his political enemies, those who are going to be declared enemies of the people. And it will include prominent American citizens who he is marking for expulsion.
Dr. Hahn, recently I came across one of the amazing articles, and which is entitled "Order Without America: How the International System Can Survive a Hostile Washington." Of course, this is, you and I have been discussing back and forth. But in the article, I want to read something to you, again, that tie into what you just explained and regarding that Donald Trump's political and also this economic agenda. And it says, and I quote, "In a remarkable short time, the second Trump administration has upended many of the precepts that have guided international order since the end of the World War II." I mean, again, Dr. Hahn, you're a historian. You understand what happened in World War II, but people, again, it could be fair or unfair to compare when we look at the world order during the World War II period and to 2025. We're not saying that Donald Trump is completely reshaping the structure, but right now, let's be honest, America today is losing friends from the left to the right. I mean, right now, it's not just political signal that we're missing. It's the political noises that we can't shut under Donald Trump. So that's why I want you to help us, because your book talk about from the historical perspective. Can we talk a bit further, in addition to Andrew Jackson, in addition to other earlier period? What are some of the late period that close to what's happening today can also serve as a lesson or serve as a wake-up call to understand this distortion or this complexity of the international order? Your thoughts?
Right. Well, I mean, that's a big question, but let me take a shot at it. First of all, it's important to recognize that the international order that emerged out of World War II is what we usually regard as the Cold War, right? Where two major superpowers, the United States, which was not only militarily victorious, but was not destroyed during the war like so many other countries, and the Soviet Union, which, was, suffered enormous casualties and damage. But without the Soviet Union, the Nazis would have won.
Right.
So, there's a world order that comes out of the World War II, and the United States presented itself as, a symbol of democracy against Soviet communism and related left-wing movements that the Soviet Union aligned itself with. And the United States was clearly an imperial power, and it was extending its reach. You remember, we were the Vietnam War, for example, which went on for over 10 years, which is the first war actually the United States lost.
That's right.
And so part of why, so that's one frame. And then, of course, the Cold War ends, and the Soviet Union unravels. And in the 1990s, it appears that the United States stands alone as the major superpower. But the idea of a kind of American empire was sort of bipartisan, meaning Democrats and Republicans. Politicians, political leaders pretty much bought into it and supported it. They supported it in terms of economic reach. They supported it in terms of, political and cultural reach. The USAID was initially generated as an attempt to mobilize people in so-called, at that point, we call them third world countries. Now we talk about the global South. But it was seen as a way of fending off socialism and communism. Now, it has developed in ways that, it pursues many policies that are designed, to help people who are suffering, people who are exposed to potentially deadly diseases, HIV and the likes. What Trump has managed to do is pull in a lot of Americans who are kind of isolationist, meaning this is the America First. Now, of course, the America First slogan was initially advanced by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. So, but in any event, this America Firstism is about withdrawing from participation, the kind of participation we had in international affairs. It is about turning ourselves inward. It's not outright isolationist, but it's also seen as a critique and objection to globalization, right? Neoliberal globalization was obviously hammered a lot of people in the United States and elsewhere. So Trump has tapped into that. And yet at the same time, he is talking about recreating, in some ways, it's kind of Vladimir Putin's vision. Putin is interested in kind of recreating the Russian Empire. Donald Trump is imagining another kind of American empire by talking about Greenland and Canada and the Panama Canal in a potentially very aggressive ways of using military force to do that. Now, I don't really know, how long he can balance this so that, the large numbers of people who thought he represented an alternative to American involvement in wars elsewhere, with his objectives of maybe getting us into wars with our former friends. And that's, as you pointed out, really one of the things that's so shocking. Although he, there's nothing that's happening now that he didn't say he would do. It's not like many politicians who run for office and tell you one story and they, then follow another storyline once they get into power. He's told us all about this. I mean, it's shocking to watch. And of course, as you can imagine, people, it's especially shocking for white Americans of the middle class and up who have had the luxury of being able to have the law on their side. It's not exactly shocking to people of color or obviously undocumented people or many other people in the United States, including working class white people, who have not had the luxury. If you're a Black American and you walk out of your house, whether you are a teenager or an adult man or woman, you don't know what's going to happen to you. You could get rounded up at any point. So this is nothing new to them. It's obviously shocking to all of us. And what is really disturbing is Trump's interest in turning on former allies. And I think this is part of a kind of destabilization policy that has no long range logic to it. I mean, if you want to say, well, what is he after? I mean, the only thing you could say at this point, he's after provoking fear and uncertainty and vulnerability, and as a way of establishing himself as the most powerful person in the world, perhaps in some kind of alliance with Putin. Or others on the right, but he's much more powerful than Putin is, and I don't know. The tariff question is his crazy idea that tariffs somehow or other not only empower the United States, but he's interested, he's someone who wants to get rid of taxes. I think part of the reason he's doing this tariff stuff is he wants to cut income taxes or corporate taxes even further as a way of enriching people like himself. And he's got to find some way to pay, for the federal budget. Of course, then he hires, Elon Musk, to slash billions of dollars so that together tariffs and the budget cuts are meant to pay for the very large tax cuts, and even talks about, well, let's get rid of the income tax entirely, which of course would have everything land, you'd have sales taxes, excise taxes, which would all land on the people who are less able to pay for them.
And of course, Dr. Hahn, that throughout the news that we have heard, and also we have read, that internally, that Elon Musk right now, it's struggling with some of the key cabinet members. And again, not everyone appreciates or really enjoys the presence of Elon Musk. Now, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about, of course, in reality, not everyone is the fan of Donald Trump. That we have heard and we've seen that throughout the media, New York Representative Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and also independent senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, they have been on a tour that nationwide is called Fight the Oligarchy. So, Dr. Hahn, from your perspective, briefly, how do we understand such political, I don't want to use the word motivation, but this political drive for those two to get on the road and to saying that it's time to fight back, it's time to fight against Elon Musk, Donald Trump. And also another way people asked the question to Sanders before, it was basically saying that, hey, when we see you on the road and your presentation drew a large crowd, is there any way that, say, maybe perhaps Bernie Sanders is pulling the third party or trying to say, hey, the two-party system's broken, so perhaps it's time to try something new. So again, Dr. Hahn, from your perspective, what is the methodology for AOC and Bernie Sanders?
What Bernie and AOC are doing is not only really important at the moment, but it demonstrates that it's the country. It's not just dominated by illiberalism. There's a lot of other things. And if you think about it, in some ways back in 2016, one of, I think, the most striking thing about that election was not Trump, because he was sort of following in a path that had already been laid out. It was Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders ran as a socialist. I mean, he didn't say, no, I'm not really a socialist. He said, I'm a socialist. He's a democratic socialist. He mobilized a tremendous following, especially of young people. And it's conceivable that, the mainstream Democratic Party screwed him over. Okay. So I think what you can see going on with Sanders and AOC is an attempt to it shows the deep division in the Democratic Party between those on the left, broadly understood, and the mainstream Democratic Party that is much more aligned with well-to-do donors and with socially liberal-oriented people highly educated, professional, that they're not so great on economic questions, but they're kind of aligned with the Democratic Party, for other reasons, and because they're globalists too. And, Bernie Sanders and AOC are mobilizing the left of the Democratic Party, around issues about political and economic democracy, around social democracy, about thinking about, people's rights in a much broader way than they tend to have been thought about before. And I would say you do ask a really interesting question about, are they aiming for a third party? The answer is, I don't know. And, one of the things about U.S. political history is that it has had significant 30 parties. I mean, my first book was about the populist party, the making of populism in the 19th century. I mean, this was real populism. It was a movement. They called themselves populists. That was a critique of, economic and political power, unlike today's populists, which don't even call themselves populists, and they're just seen as, people who are rageful or, engaged in a backlash. I think it is true that the Democratic Party is in deep trouble. And the Democratic Party, arguably has kind of exhausted itself, because the sort of perspectives and policies that have been a big umbrella for a long time have, shown themselves, to be, there's really a lack of agreement. It looked like the party was moving left, especially because of Bernie in the, in 2016 and during the first Trump administration. I mean, think about everyone who's buying into universal health care. I mean, there were things that were really Bernie's issues, and also a Green New Deal and all of this stuff. And now, there's not only a backlash from the Trump administration, but there's a lot of Democrats who blame their loss in 2024 on, the Democratic Party not staying in the center. You can decide for yourself what is most compelling. I don't know if they are interested in organizing a third party. I think Bernie Sanders, as you put it, he's an independent. He caucuses with the Democrats, but he's not a Democrat. And AOC, who I think, along with Jasmine Crockett, are two of the most interesting people in American political life. And one of the things I have learned, and I think, it's not as clear to many people, is that the people who I think are best able to look forward in, for me, a progressive way, are women of color, because they have a lot of skills and they understand power in ways that other people do not. They understand power in terms of race. They understand power in terms of gender. They understand power as working people. And I think people like AOC, it's not surprising that, she has a college degree. She worked in a bar, and then she aligned with the Democratic Socialists. She's incredibly articulate, incredibly visionary, and it's not surprising because of, she's had a look at the world from a point of view that a lot of other people have not. So I think, I think we're in a very worrisome moment, because whatever you want to say, Trump has enormous power, and Trump is determined to keep expanding it and to crush his enemies. And my fear is that he's looking for, not just like he's looking for a confrontation with the courts, and he's having it. I think he's looking for an opportunity to invoke a national emergency and to call out the army. And in some ways, Jamie Raskin, the congressman, I think had it right when he said, look, if you want to protest this, it's better to do it on a more local basis. There's smaller protests. They're harder to, push, to kind of come down on. If you had a gigantic protest, say in Washington, D.C., where you could probably bring in a couple of million people, that would be his opportunity to invoke the Insurrection Act. So I think that, we can't fool ourselves.
Right.
We're looking at a situation in which, he could basically suspend, those who are aware of German history, what did Hitler do? It was the Reichstag fire, someone who attempted to set fire to the, legislature, which was his opportunity to suspend, representative politics there and to take full power. And I'm sure people who were involved in the Project 2025, who know that point by point, they don't have majority support for what they want to do. But, they would be fine. I'm sure this is something that they're thinking about. And that's something I'm very fearful of, because not only would it be a fully authoritarian regime, but a lot of people would be hurt.
Of course, Dr. Han, I agree with you 100%. I mean, it's rather devastating to see what's happening to our political system today, and also knowing that for the rest of the 4 years, that things, again, hope for the best, either can get better before it's getting way too late. Well, Dr. Han, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, your book touched on the critical concept of political system, it's illiberalism. And also you dive into the book that from the history perspective. I want to end our conversation by asking you the question related to younger generations today. And we've seen that younger generations across the spectrums are very vocal, extremely active in changing the social, political, and even this economic agenda. So from your perspective, how crucial it is for the younger generations today to get educated, for example, by reading your book and by reading the books that really can equip them to fight for a fight against the oligarchy and a fight against the injustice system, so that we are able to see the country it's back on the track. Your final thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I mean, obviously, young people they're the future, and they need to make the future, and they're going to make the future one way or another. And it's not surprising that the Trump administration and the radical right are targeting universities, or they're targeting any kind of educational institution, public educational institutions, and they're raising questions about what can be taught and what won't be taught. I mean, they're already, banning books. I mean, the U.S. Naval Academy, pulled 350 books from its library because they were thought to be objectionable in terms of representing race or sexuality or gender or any one of a number of issues. To me, one of the worrisome things that happened in 2024 is that back in 2016, it was very clear that people in the, I'd say, 18 to 35 age cohort, were clearly Democratic, and a lot of them had been mobilized by Bernie. One of the things we saw in this recent election is, a shift, not a dramatic shift, but a shift that was notable, especially on the part of young white people, women as well as men, to supporting Trump. And, if you look back historically on the fascist regimes that struggled for power and achieved it in the 1920s and 1930s in Italy and Germany in particular, it was mobilizing a lot of young people who were very discontented, who were depressed about their future, and somehow, were energized by a vision of masculinity, of violence, and of aggressive nationalism, that was offered up. To that extent, it goes to your point, which is, I don't think it's going to be reading. I mean, I'd like them to read my book, but I don't think it's reading my book. First of all, we have to defend our educational institutions, because as well as I do, that, having the opportunity for young people to encounter ideas, to be with other people who care about ideas, whatever the ideas are. I mean, I happen to think that, and I think they know that, when people encounter ideas that are more progressive, they tend to gravitate because, it's about aligning themselves with the, most people in the world and their concerns about, how people have suffered and whether we can make you and other people of your generation, the assortment of challenges that are being faced. We don't even talk about climate change anymore. And, here we've elected a regime that utterly rejects science and wants to keep pumping oil and so on and so forth. And you think we're worried about undocumented people now, but climate change is going to make large sections of the world uninhabitable, and the kind of migrations that it will unleash are beyond anything that can be conceived. So I do think that it's important, for young people, obviously, to engage, to get involved. When I was teaching a class at NYU in the fall, and after the election, people were really upset, obviously. And, I was mindful of my position, so I didn't want to go on any political rant. But I said, look, if there's at least three things you need to do now. One is to heal yourself, and that is with family and friends and people who are close to you. The second thing is to look out for people who are the most vulnerable, and to do whatever you can to. NYU has the largest number of international students of any college or university in the country. They're terrified. They don't want to come to class because the administration at NYU has not made it clear that they will be protected, and they're on secure visas.
Right.
They're not here as undocumented people, but they're worried about being rounded up. And some of my colleagues are going back to teaching online, or they're moving their classes off campus, which, is a recognition of what we're up against. So we have to look out for people who are vulnerable. And it looks like there's a lot more people who are vulnerable, as you pointed out, and not simply people who are not citizens of the United States or not green card holders, but American citizens. And I think the third thing I said to them is, look, do something. Do something smart. You're not going to change the world tomorrow. We're just going to try to, kind of dig in and prevent, as much as we can prevent. And there's many, many things you can do. And what it makes you feel like you are doing something. And it also puts you in contact with people like you. So you're not alone. And that's really important at a time like this, because it's very easy to feel isolated. And once you feel isolated, it's hopeless and you give up. Do something once a week, do whatever it is, do something. And then we have to think very hard about moving forward in a larger way that's not going to happen very quickly, but is very important nonetheless.
That's right, Dr. Hahn. Again, to borrow the phrase that you just mentioned, it's time for us to put our actions behind the words. It's one small time and one small step at a time, and able to make a significant difference. Well, again, Dr. Hahn, such a pleasure to speak to you. Again, ladies and gentlemen, and strongly encourage you go online to connect with Dr. Stephen Hahn and also his amazing book. He's currently a professor at a university at the New York University, and strongly encourage go online, check out this amazing book. Again, Dr. Hahn, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Very good.